Northern Montana, January 1976. If you were standing on the ridgeline looking down into the valley that winter, you wouldn't have seen smoke rising from the chimney of the old Miller property. In a landscape defined by the aggressive vertical plumes of wood smoke fighting the downdrafts, the Miller place looked dead. It looked abandoned. The main farmhouse, a sprawling Victorian relic that bled heat like a stuck pig, sat dark and silent against the snow. To the casual observer, or even the concerned neighbor driving past on the county road, it looked like a tragedy waiting to be discovered when the thaw came. But if you looked closer, if you drove your truck up that iced-over driveway and walked past the dead house to the large timber-framed barn out back, you would have seen the anomaly. Through the gaps in the weathered barn siding, a faint, amber glow pulsed in the darkness. It wasn't the flickering, hungry orange of a wood fire, and it wasn't the harsh blue-white of a welding arc. It was steady. It was calm. It was the visual signature of efficiency in a world going mad with cold. Inside that barn, a man named Warren was conducting an experiment that the rest of the county called suicide. He wasn't a farmer, though he lived among them. He was a retired structural engineer who had spent 20 years calculating load limits and thermal bridges for industrial freezers. When he bought the property, the locals assumed he'd patch up the farmhouse, buy a massive cast-iron stove, and burn through 10 cords of wood a winter like everyone else. They were wrong. Warren looked at the thermometer, which read 20 degrees below zero, and then he looked at the farmhouse. He did the math. The math told him the house was a losing battle, a sieve of drafty windows and uninsulated lath and plaster walls that would demand a fortune in fuel just to keep the pipes from bursting. So Warren shut the water off at the main. He drained the pipes. He boarded up the windows of the big house and walked away from it. He moved his life 100 yards west, into the drafty, cavernous space of the tractor barn. It wasn't that he liked the cold. He respected it. He respected it enough to know that you don't fight a Montana winter with brute force. You fight it with geometry. The glow coming from the barn wasn't magic. It was a single kerosene lantern hanging inside a structure that shouldn't have existed, a structure that defied the architectural vernacular of the American West. While his neighbors were waking up every 2 hours to stoke dying fires, Warren was sleeping soundly, proving a point that nobody else was ready to hear. To understand why Warren was sleeping in a barn, you have to understand the economic and atmospheric squeeze of 1976. The energy crisis was still a fresh bruise on the national psyche. Propane prices were climbing, and heating oil was becoming a luxury item that folks in this valley hoarded like gold dust. The traditional method of survival out here was volume. Big fires, big coats, big meals. But Warren was a man of margins. He looked at the barn not as a shelter for livestock, but as a primary envelope. The wind outside was clocking 40 miles per hour, stripping the heat away from every surface it touched. But inside the barn, the air was still. It was cold, freezing actually, but it was still. That stillness was the first variable in Warren's equation. By building inside the barn, he had already eliminated the wind chill factor, the greatest thief of British thermal units, or BTUs. Warren's logic was clinical. A human body generates about 350 to 400 BTUs of heat per hour just by existing. A small propane heater might put out 10,000. In the big farmhouse, that heat dispersed into 2,500 square feet of drafty rooms and vanished into the attic. It was inefficient. It was wasteful. It offended his sensibilities. He needed a tertiary envelope. The barn was the first shell. The clothes on his back were the second. He needed a living space that was essentially a thermos bottle, a sealed, pressurized vessel where every calorie of heat was trapped, circulated, and reused. He didn't want a cabin with corners. Corners trap dead air. Corners encourage mold. Corners are weak points where drafts congregate. He needed a shape that encouraged convection, a continuous loop of rising warm air and falling cool air that would keep the temperature uniform without a blower fan. He decided on a Quonset hut. The shape was military surplus, agricultural utility, and ugly as sin to the traditionalists. It was a semi-cylinder, an arch of corrugated steel. But Warren wasn't building a standard 40-foot machine shed. He was building a miniature. He designed a capsule, 12 feet wide, 20 feet long, with a ceiling height of just 7 feet at the apex. 240 square feet. To the men in town, that was the size of a master bedroom. To Warren, it was a mathematically perfect volume of air to heat. He sketched the plans on the back of a receipt from the hardware store. Steel ribs, a neoprene thermal brake, fiberglass batting, and an interior skin of plywood. He wasn't building a house, he was building a machine for living. The construction began in November, just as the frost was locking the ground into iron. Warren worked alone, his breath clouding in the dim light of the barn. He cleared a space in the center of the dirt floor, away from the walls where the drafts whistled through the gaps. He didn't pour a slab. Concrete is a heat sink that sucks warmth out of a room. Instead, he built a raised platform on pressure-treated 4x4 skids. He created a floating floor. He laid down a sheet of vapor barrier, then 6 inches of high-density rigid foam, then the subfloor. This was crucial. The cold creeping up from the frozen earth was a relentless enemy. By elevating the cabin 18 inches off the ground, he created an air gap. The air under the cabin would reach an equilibrium with the air in the barn, acting as a buffer, preventing the conductive heat loss that freezes toes in the middle of the night. Then came the ribs. He bent the galvanized steel hoops himself using a jig he'd welded together. The sound of the drill driving self-tapping screws into the steel echoed off the high rafters of the barn. Thwack-zing, thwack-zing. It was a rhythmic, industrial noise that confused the local wildlife. Once the skeleton was up, he skinned the exterior with corrugated steel sheets. This was the moment the project started to look crazy. A metal house? In winter, metal conducts cold. Touch a steel wrench in January, and it'll burn the skin off your hand. But Warren wasn't finished. The steel was just the armor. The magic was on the inside. He applied a technique known in industrial engineering as thermal braking. He glued strips of rubber along the interior of the steel ribs before attaching the interior framing. This prevented the cold steel from touching the warm wood of the interior walls. There was no bridge for the cold to cross. Then he packed the cavity, a full 6 inches of depth, with fiberglass batting. He didn't compress it. Insulation works by trapping air pockets, and compressing it destroys the R value. He fluffed it, packed it gently, and sealed it behind a continuous sheet of 6mm polyethylene. He taped every seam. He taped the staples. He caulked the edges. He was building a submarine for the air. When he finished the interior plywood walls, the structure sat in the middle of the barn like a strange, silver beetle. It was ugly. It was small. And when Warren lit a single candle inside it before the door was even hung, he watched the temperature on the wall verify his math. It rose 2 degrees in 10 minutes, just from a candle. The social friction began the moment Warren went into town for supplies. It was early December, and the snow was already piling up against the guardrails of the highway. He pulled his truck into the lot at the Feed and Seed, the unofficial headquarters of local opinion. The bell on the door jingled, cutting through the low murmur of conversation by the coffee pot. Dale was there. Dale was a third-generation rancher, a man who measured success by head of cattle and square footage of timber. He was big, loud, and wore a canvas coat that smelled of diesel and wet dog. To Dale, a home was a fortress of logs, something you fought the elements with. He leaned back against the counter, a toothpick working between his teeth, and watched Warren load a meager supply of propane fittings onto the belt. "Heard you moved into the tractor shed, Warren?" Dale said, his voice carrying easily to the back of the store. "House too big for you?" The other men chuckled, a low, dry sound. They looked at Warren with a mixture of pity and confusion. They knew the Miller place was drafty, but abandoning it for a shed seemed like the act of a man who had snapped. Warren didn't look up from his wallet. He placed exact change on the counter. "The house is a waste, Dale. I'm trying something different." "Different?" Dale laughed, a sharp bark. "I drove by, saw that tin can you're riveting together. My granddaddy used to keep pigs in a Quonset. You telling me you're gonna ride out a Montana winter in a pig pen? Inside a barn?" Dale shook his head, looking around the room for validation. "That steel is gonna turn into a freezer. You'll wake up a popsicle by February." That is, if you don't suffocate first. A man needs a fire. A man needs wood. Physics doesn't care about wood, Dale, Warren said, picking up his bag. He met Dale's eyes. There was no anger in Warren's face, just a flat, weary certainty. It's about retention. You heat the air, you keep the air. You're trying to heat the whole valley with that chimney of yours. It's called living, Warren, Dale called after him as he walked to the door. It's called not living like a rat in a hole. You mark my words. When the Siberian Express comes down, you'll be knocking on my door begging for a spot by the hearth. Warren just nodded and walked out into the biting wind. He knew what they thought. They thought he was cheap. They thought he was eccentric. But mostly they were terrified that he might be right, because if he was right, all their chopping, stacking, and hauling of wood was just wasted motion. By mid-January, the sky over the northern Rockies turned the color of a bruised plum. The air pressure dropped so fast that people claimed they could feel their joints aching. The weatherman on the AM radio stopped making jokes about the nippy weather and started using words like historic and life-threatening. A high-pressure system from the Arctic was colliding with moisture coming off the Pacific, creating a bomb cyclone that was targeting their specific latitude. The locals called it the White Death. In town, the panic was palpable. The grocery store shelves were stripped of bread and milk. The gas station ran out of diesel. Dale and his sons spent 3 days straight chainsawing fallen timber, building a woodpile that stretched the length of his porch. They were preparing for a siege. They caulked their windows, hung heavy blankets over the doors, and stocked the pantry. The fear was real. In these parts, if the power went out, and it always did, your furnace blower stopped working. If you didn't have a wood stove and 5 tons of fuel, you died. It was that simple. Up at the Miller place, Warren did not chop wood. He did not panic. He walked the perimeter of his barn, checking the siding. He nailed a few loose boards shut to keep the worst of the wind from battering his inner sanctum. He checked the propane tank that fed his small catalytic heater. It was 3/4 full. He checked his water storage, jerry cans kept inside the insulated envelope. Then he went inside his tin can. He closed the heavy, insulated door. The latch clicked with the solid, airtight sound of a bank vault. He looked at the thermometer mounted on the curved wall. It was 68 degrees inside. Outside, the wind was beginning to scream, a high-pitched keen that sounded like metal tearing. The first flakes of the blizzard began to fly hard and horizontal, like buckshot. Warren poured a cup of coffee, sat in his armchair, and opened a book on metallurgy. The test had begun. The storm hit at 2 a.m., and it didn't knock. It kicked the door in. The meteorological data from the Great Falls Station later confirmed that the pressure drop was one of the most severe ever recorded in the continental United States. An atmospheric vacuum that sucked the Arctic air down the spine of the Rockies like water down a drain. At the Miller property, the wind didn't just blow. It scoured. It carried ice crystals that had been hardened by the sub-zero temperatures into an abrasive grit, stripping the paint off the south-facing side of the old Victorian farmhouse. Inside that farmhouse, the battle was already being lost. The physics of a traditional home in a storm like this are a nightmare of fluid dynamics. As the wind screamed over the jagged rooflines and gables of the big house, it created a massive low-pressure zone on the leeward side and the roof. This suction acted like a giant lung, pulling the warm air out of the house through every microscopic crack in the attic and eaves. And to replace that vacuum, the house inhaled. It sucked freezing, 0-degree air in through the floorboards, the electrical outlets, and the window sashes. Dale, down in the valley, was living this nightmare in real time. He was awake, wrapped in a quilt, feeding a cast-iron stove that was roaring red hot. But it didn't matter. The stack effect was working against him. The hotter he made the fire, the faster the hot air shot up the chimney, drawing more cold air into the room to replace it. He was burning wood to heat the sky. His feet were freezing while his face was burning. He watched his breath fog in the living room. The thermometer on his wall read 50 degrees and was dropping a degree every hour. The wind howled around his eaves, a banshee wail that rattled the sash weights in the window frames. It was the sound of nature dismantling his shelter, finding the weak points in the mortar and the wood, proving that brute force and volume were no match for the relentless kinetic energy of the storm. 100 yards away, inside the barn, the acoustic signature was entirely different. The wind hit the barn, yes, but the barn was just the outer skin. It rattled. It groaned. Snow blew through the gaps in the siding, piling up in drifts on the dirt floor. But inside the Quonset, the tertiary envelope, there was only a deep, muffled hum. The cylindrical shape of the cabin offered no flat surfaces for the wind to buffet. The air inside the barn, while freezing, was static. It acted as a buffer zone, stripping the wind of its convective power before it ever touched the insulated skin of Warren's living space. Warren lay in his bunk, listening to the muffled violence outside. He looked at his data log. Interior temperature, 66 degrees. Fuel consumption, minimal. He wasn't fighting the storm. He was hiding from it in a mathematically perfect pocket. The difference wasn't courage. The difference was aerodynamics. The crisis point arrived at 4:30 a.m. when the power grid finally surrendered. A mainline transformer 3 miles east blew under the strain of ice-laden lines and galloping conductors. The valley plunged into absolute darkness. For the neighbors, this was the catastrophe they feared. Without electricity, the blower fans on the modern furnaces died. The circulation pumps for the few boiler systems froze. The hum of civilization cut out, leaving only the scream of the wind. In the big houses, the silence was terrifying because it meant the heat was dead. The thermal mass of a stick-framed house is negligible. Without active heat input, the temperature creates a free-fall graph. Within 20 minutes, the interior of the average home in the valley began to equalize with the exterior. Pipes that weren't wrapped burst. Frost began to form on the inside of the windows. Inside the Quonset, Warren watched the single light bulb hanging from the apex of the arch flicker and die. The darkness was total. He didn't move. He didn't scramble for a flashlight. He lay there and waited. He was testing the thermal flywheel. He had designed the interior with dense materials, the plywood, the books, the water storage, the human body itself, to hold heat. But the real hero was the envelope. With the heat source gone, the cabin became a battery, storing the energy it had accumulated. He lit the kerosene lantern, the same soft amber glow that had confused the neighbors. The flame was steady. There was no draft. He checked the thermometer. It hadn't moved. The insulation was doing its job, trapping the kinetic energy of the air molecules, refusing to let them conduct through the walls to the freezing barn air outside. Warren picked up his clipboard. This was the moment of validation, the data point that justified the ridicule. He wrote down the time, 0500 hours. External temp, minus 32 degrees Fahrenheit.
Barn temp, minus 15 grader Fahrenheit.
Cabin temp, 65 degrees Fahrenheit. He sat up and poured a cup of coffee from a thermos he'd filled before bed. It was still hot. He took a sip, the steam rising in a lazy spiral, unaffected by the chaos tearing the county apart outside. He imagined Dale and the others, frantic, chopping furniture, huddling together under piles of wool, fighting a losing war of attrition. He felt a pang of sympathy, but it was overridden by the cold satisfaction of the engineer. They had trusted tradition. He had trusted the R-value. The lantern hissed softly. He opened his book again. He would wait for the sun. The dawn didn't bring warmth. It brought a gray, diffuse light that revealed a landscape erased by white. The snow had drifted 6 feet high against the north face of the barn. The wind had finally died down to a sullen gust, leaving a silence that felt heavy and bruised. Warren opened the door of the Quonset. A cloud of steam escaped with him, condensing instantly in the frigid barn air. He stepped out onto the floating floor, his boots crunching on the frost that had settled on the barn dirt. It was cold, bitterly, dangerously cold, but he was well rested. He hadn't spent the night feeding a stove. He hadn't paced the floor. He put on his heavy parka, not to survive his home, but to leave it. He needed to dig out. He grabbed the grain shovel from the wall and started working on the barn doors. The drifts were heavy, packed tight by the wind pressure. It took him an hour to clear a path to the daylight. When he finally stepped outside, the glare was blinding. The valley was a sculpture of ice. The road was gone. The fences were gone. He looked toward the farmhouse, his own abandoned Victorian relic. It looked grim. Icicles 6 feet long hung from the eaves, signaling massive heat loss from the attic. The windows were frosted over completely, opaque dead eyes staring out at the wasteland. Then he looked down the road toward Dale's place. There was no smoke coming from the chimney. That was a bad sign. In weather like this, no smoke meant the fire was out or worse. Warren didn't hesitate. He strapped on his snowshoes, kept near the door for this exact contingency, and began the trek. The snow was waist-deep in places where the wind had deposited the drifts. He moved methodically, pacing himself. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense. He was a neighbor checking the variables. As he approached Dale's ranch, the silence was absolute. He saw the woodshed, it was half empty. He saw the truck, buried to the windows. He climbed the porch steps, which screamed under the frozen wood, and hammered on the door. "Dale!" he shouted. The sound was swallowed by the snow. He tried the handle. Unlocked. He pushed inside. The air inside Dale's house was shocking. It wasn't just cold. It was damp, a clammy, tomb-like chill that settled into the bones faster than the dry cold outside. The smell of wet ash and stale fear hung heavy. In the living room, huddled under a mountain of quilts on the sofa, were Dale and his wife. They were shivering violently, the early stages of hypothermia setting in. The wood stove was cold. They had run out of dry wood hours ago and had been too exhausted to go out and fight the drifts for the green timber that wouldn't burn anyway. Dale looked up, his eyes glassy, his lips blue. He saw Warren standing there, unzipped parka revealing a flannel shirt, looking like he'd just stepped out of a warm bath. "Warren," Dale croaked, his voice a cracked whisper. "Power's out. Furnace died. We couldn't keep up." He looked at Warren with a mix of confusion and desperation. He expected Warren to be dead. He expected the crazy man in the tin can to be a frozen statue. Instead, Warren was standing there, radiating vitality. "Get up," Warren said, his voice flat and authoritative. "Wrap the blankets around you. We're moving." "Moving where?" Dale's wife asked, her teeth chattering. "The roads are blocked. There's nowhere." "My place," Warren said. "The barn." Dale laughed, a weak, delirious sound. "The barn? You want us to freeze to death in a shed?" "I want you to live," Warren said. He didn't argue. He didn't explain the thermodynamics. He just grabbed Dale under the arm and hauled him up. "Walk, or stay here and die. That's the data set. Choose." The walk back was a blur of misery for the neighbors, a slow trudge through the biting cold that seemed to sear their lungs. Warren broke the trail, cutting the wind for them. When they reached the barn, Dale looked at the structure with despair. It looked like a ruin, wind-battered and dark. Warren guided them through the small access door he'd cut into the main slider. They stumbled into the gloom of the barn interior. It was freezing in there, the air still and sharp. Dale slumped. "It's cold, Warren. It's just as cold." "Wait," Warren said. He led them to the silver curve of the Quonset hut sitting in the shadows. It looked alien. A capsule from another planet dropped into the dirt. Warren unlatched the heavy, insulated door. He swung it open. The heat didn't drift out. It pushed out. A wall of 65-degree air, smelling faintly of coffee and kerosene, rolled over them. It was a physical blow, a sudden shift in climate that made Dale gasp. Warren ushered them inside and sealed the door behind them. The silence returned, but this time, it was a warm silence. The lantern was glowing. The small catalytic heater hummed on its pilot setting. Dale stood there, snow melting off his boots onto the mat, staring around the small, curved room. He touched the plywood walls. They were warm. He looked at the thermometer. "How?" Dale whispered, stripping off his frozen gloves. "You don't have a stove. You don't have a furnace. How is it this hot?" Warren sat down on his stool and pointed to the wall assembly. "Conservation, Dale. You were trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. I just fixed the bucket." He didn't lecture them on thermal bridging or convective loops. He just poured them coffee. He let the room do the talking. For the next 2 days, while the county dug itself out and the power crews fought their way up the canyon, 3 people lived in 240 square feet. They played cards, they read, and they watched the thermometer. When the thaw finally came a week later, and the roads were cleared, the skeptics came. They didn't come to mock anymore. They came to inspect. A convoy of 3 trucks, including the county assessor and 2 other ranchers, pulled up to the barn. They had heard the story from Dale. They didn't believe it. They wanted to see the trick. They wanted to find the hidden generator or the underground steam pipe. Warren met them at the door. He didn't block their way. He invited them in. He let them inspect the walls. He let them feel the thickness of the insulation. He showed them his logbook. He opened the ledger and read the numbers out loud, his voice steady, acting as the auditor of his own survival. January 22nd. Low temp, -34. Fuel used, 2 pounds of propane. January 23rd. Low temp, -38. Fuel used, 1.8 pounds. The men stood in the center of the Quonset, hats in hands, looking at the exposed cross-section Warren had left unfinished near the vent. The layers of steel, rubber, fiberglass, and wood. They were looking at the future, though they called it a contraption. They tried to find a flaw in the logic, a reason to dismiss it and go back to their drafty timber kings. But the math was relentless. Dale, standing with them, simply kicked the toe of his boot against the baseboard. "It works," Dale said, looking at the other men. "I thought it was a coffin. Turned out to be a lifeboat." Warren didn't smile. He didn't need to. He just closed the ledger. "It's not magic," he said, looking the assessor in the eye. "It's just geometry. And a little bit of foam." The Miller place never did get renovated. The Victorian house eventually collapsed under a heavy snow load 5 years later, a pile of rotted lumber and broken glass. But the barn stood, and inside the barn the cabin stayed. Over the next decade, you started seeing them appear in the valley, strange, smaller structures, tucked into hillsides or built inside existing shells. People stopped bragging about how many cords of wood they burned and started bragging about how few. Warren didn't start a revolution with a speech. He started it with a thermostat. He proved that, in the high country, toughness isn't about how much pain you can endure. It's about how smart you can build. And on the coldest nights, when the wind howled down from the divide, looking for a victim, the amber glow from the barn remained steady, a beacon of competence in the dark.